A lot of new interesting ideas about co-management. But really, co-management isn't that new. The Northwest Treaty Tribes have been engaged in forms of co-management now for decades. And fortunately, we have Mr. David Sones here with us, who's a member of the Makah Tribe. He's a Makah whiting fisherman. He's also the tribal representative on the Pacific Fishery Management Council. And if you look at his bio, he's served on more natural resource panels than I can. I didn't even know there were so many. But so he brings a wealth of knowledge. And welcome, David.
Thank you, Merrick. I'd like to also thank Dave and Andre for inviting me here to give you some information about how the tribes work in this process and some of our history of management, and co-management is a big part of what we do. If you go back during the mid-1880s, and this ain't going to take that long, I'm not going to go that far back, but the Stevens treaties were completed by the late 1850s or so through Congress and ratified. And what that did was the tribes, and this is a question, a position that we constantly have to educate people about. The tribes ceded our lands to the United States government, and we also ceded half of our fishing rights to the United States government. Many times you'll see in many conversations that somehow we were given these rights back through the Bolt decision or US v. Washington, when in fact we were given these rights to the federal government during our treaty process. As we moved through history, our tribes continued to fish, on commercial subsistence levels. And as we moved into the 70s, we were not able to access many of our fish from either the ocean side or the river sides, and the tribes are primarily concentrated on salmon at the time. The US v. Washington case came through. The tribes had won what our arguments had always been, that these were reserved rights of ours. 50% of those rights the tribes were entitled to. I've heard many times that we were 3% of the population and they're receiving 50% of the resource. No, in fact, we owned all of the resource, and we were the dominant population at the time of the treaty. So they did a good job in educating the public about what was wrong and what we perceive as right. After that case went through, it was still challenged until 1979. It was sent up to the Supreme Court and reaffirmed the decision that Bolt made, that the tribes were in fact entitled to 50% of the salmon resources at the time, and that co-management would need to be established with the states and the federal government in order for us to manage and provide catch sharing on this 50-50 basis, with conservation in the forefront of meeting the escapement goals of what we understood the fisheries to need to sustain themselves. So we created this very long and adaptive approach to how do we figure that out? How do we know what fish are where? How do we get them back to the river so we make sure that they meet their spawning needs, and then that the tribes that live within the rivers get their share of the fish, and then the tribes in the mixed stock areas are able to also acquire their resources and balance this all out with the state and meet our conservation objectives. We worked with the federal government, with the states, to create a very elaborate modeling system to evaluate if we were in fact meeting those objectives and providing for the resource first of all, so it is sustainable. As we came into the Magnuson Act, and I relate the tribal position much of the Rodney Dangerfield of lack of respect. We just constantly got left out of these processes. I think acts and statutes have done more damage to tribal positions in our representation and protecting our resources than many of the other impacts that we've had in trying to protect those resources. The Marine Mammal Protection Act was an example of the tribes are pretty much left out of that process and weren't represented there. It's what Makah faces, these issues with marine mammals today. The Magnuson-Stevens Act, when it was created, did not recognize tribal participation in the process, and much of it was done through the Fish and Wildlife Service at the time. And during the 80s, the tribes did get a seat on the council, but that was given to us. Again, we didn't take it. It was given to us through the state of Washington. It actually gave us one of their obligatory seats, I believe, and we served in that capacity till the reauthorization in 1996, where the tribes actually did have a seat at the council, and that seat represents 26 tribes from California, the 2 on the Klamath River, the 4 tribes in the Columbia River Basin, and then the 20 tribes in the Northwest. Through that process, I'm just amazed every year with the salmon process that goes on, beginning with the tribes in the states coming together and figuring out the escapement and forecasts for the coming year. That process goes on, they reach agreement. We get into the Pacific Council process where each of the tribes in the states are working together and independently to arrive at meeting their conservation objectives and their harvest goals through that process. We don't see a lot of this on the floor when we're deliberating up there through the council process. Much of this takes place in the little back rooms that all of these groups are working towards to try and achieve ultimately ocean allocations for salmon. And that was much of our involvement in the early part of the Magnuson Act, was primarily focused on salmon management and meeting those meeting the goals of the USV Washington and USV Oregon decisions. As we move further into the early 90s, the Makah Tribe particularly started looking at, first of all, I am from the Makah Tribe, and we worked on halibut through the International Halibut Commission. We did some of that work through the Pacific Council, because we do establish allocation schemes in that process. And then black cod became an important resource to us. And one of the things that we kept finding as we entered into these management arenas is the resource was being depleted at far greater rates than was possibly going to allow us even to fish in the future. We look at today at the salmon resource, and prior to the USV Washington, the amount of salmon that was harvested in that time period only represents 3% of what we harvest today. Those impacts were created primarily, not some with overfishing, but primarily the pressure on habitats, the inshore habitats where, development, farming, logging, agriculture, all the different impacts that affect salmon were largely out of our control as a management control. So the tribes have entered into many different forums where we not only involve government, but we also involve stakeholders in trying to find solutions to meet all of our objectives and maintaining those resources. As we came into groundfish, we looked at the history of it, and back in the early 80s and through the 80s, black cod particularly was clear up at like 17,000 tons was the harvest off the West Coast. By the time the tribes got into it and got interested in trying to establish our fisheries, it had been reduced to 7,000 tons, or about half of what the resource had produced in the past. So we come into the game late again, because we weren't recognized early, that we had to struggle through to try and understand why the resource had been depleted and how do we fit into that harvest management scheme and still, provide the conservation needs of the resource. And that has always been our driving force as tribal people, and it's, historically our people really did understand the impact humankind has on the resource and resource management. They understood their resources, they understood how to incorporate their fisheries into these resources and how to sustain them. As it was not a question to us, that sustainability is ultimately what we all need to do, and if we want to stay in these businesses of fishing, or if we want to provide these resources for the future. This is inherent in the way we're taught, and is something I think if we weren't of hindsight in these processes, we were foresight that maybe some of these issues of overfishing and depletion would not have became real if they would have followed these philosophies. As we looked at groundfish and we started to enter into these fisheries, we were in the same situation as Don entered into the groundfish time frame. We entered at about the same time, and we're looking at large depletions from overfishing. And I guess our greatest frustration, this is one of the things that fishermen, managers, and constituents can control. There's not the outside, as much of the outside influences that we face with salmon. This was management control, and it's something that we needed to understand better, obviously, because we obviously didn't understand the resources well enough to protect them from being overfished on individual stock bases or in complexes, or however types of management approaches that the council chose to manage with. So for us, a real critical part was the science that we needed to have to understand our influence and impact on these resources. This is a critical philosophy that our people follow, and that we wanted to make sure that the councils began to understand and drive their management towards. The SFA came out. That was very encouraging for us. It wasn't new to us, but it was something that made a big dent in changing the way and the philosophy, the thinking of how we manage resources. I think fishermen came a long ways too. I mean, I've done a number of different things. I've been a fisherman all my life since I was 12. Fished with my grandfather. I worked in management for 25, 30 years. And then I've also marketed fish and done that type of work. So I had kind of all three perspectives of how we manage and catch and market our products. And that was very helpful for me because I understood the constraints on management and what we were trying to achieve there. I understood the economic needs of the fishermen and what they needed to sustain their businesses, and then how the market plays into driving what resources we access and which ones we don't utilize. And the fishermen have come a long way in understanding that they do need to conserve and sustain these resources if they want to keep their industry alive and provide for future generations. So it's been nice to see that change. When I first walked into the Pacific Council in 1988, much of the arguments were driven by economics, not by resource management. And this was pretty frustrating for us. It's like, this is going to crash us at some point if the weight is too heavy to one side. And balance is what we also seek in everything that we do, is that you must balance your resources with your economics and sustain both. And by coming in and not having that philosophy in place was pretty frustrating for us. So we've driven that message home in many of the statements that we make and how we are represented on the council. Conservation comes first, our economies are next. And the new exciting thing I see about what we're doing with the approaches we're taking today is the investment in the science and the knowledge and understanding of our influence on these resources, and beginning to understand their life histories, how they mix together, how do we access these resources and sustain them and not overfish one species over another. And it's just been a tremendous body of science that's come together to help us understand those influences and where we fit into the ecosystem and properly sustaining and maintaining the resources. For us, that's an exciting development that I believe is where we're going to continue to have to make investments in the future, so we do have a better understanding of our impacts on resources. The things like ACLs and ABCs and that type of approach was, again, something we understood traditionally is how we manage our resources. First understand them, first understand what the limitations of these resources are, and try and understand the natural dynamics of environment and how it affects these resources, and be able to track and monitor that in some way. For our people ancestrally, they understood these things. They really understood the balance of nature and how we fit into that picture, but so much of that was lost with the clash of cultures, as I call it, as the two Western and Aboriginal civilizations came together, that a lot of our people withheld that type of information because they weren't sure how it would be used or if it would affect us negatively. But they did pass on the tradition of conserve, understand, and manage your resources so you do not affect them in a way that they won't be there for your children in the future. I see that today stronger than ever. I work in the Pacific Council, so I am kind of fond of what we do there. And I have made statements that, you know, our scientists in these councils are some of the best scientists in the world. And I think they work hard and diligently at what they're trying to do. I look at our staffs that we have in the Pacific Council, how hard they work at trying to achieve those goals that we've established under these national standards. But more than the national standards, just the right and appropriate way to manage resources has been the driving force, I think, behind the energy that the scientists and the staffs and the constituencies and the governments bring to bringing us into the future and be able to assure our future generations that we will have these resources, we will have these industries to be able to move forward. The exciting part of what I also see is that from what we're learning through the scientific bodies and what we're learning through the innovations of new gear types, new approaches to understanding how we affect management and the management decisions we make, as that all gets generated and developed, as Sam Rout made the statement yesterday, that we need to export these ideas, export these methods, and get them out to the world rather than we're looking at banning resources that come in that aren't sustainably managed. And that's an important piece of what we do too, but exporting what we know and exporting how we approach management is an important part of how I think the Magnuson Act is going to have positive effects around the world. For this, that's exciting for the tribes. We really do see that as part of how we sustain and protect the future, because we are competing on a world market now. We are up against world economics, but that doesn't mean that we can't export good ideas and encourage fishermen to come up with new ways of approaching something. I'm excited to see the pot with the lingcod stuff. I've looked at that for a long time, and it's nice to see that kind of finally moving forward. And looking at some of these other industries or other fisheries, swordfish is a very complex one that we got a healthy resource out there, but it's very hard to access with the impacts of other resources that we might have. But new and innovative ideas are coming out of that are going to, I think, be beneficial around the world as we maybe solve some of those bycatch problems and try to achieve accessing those target species. As I said before, you know, another exciting piece of where I see us going, particularly in the Pacific Council, but with all of the councils, is ecosystem management. This is something the tribes have talked about for many years and trying to understand the full body of our science, our environment, so we can better understand changes in habitat, changes in environment that we're experiencing today, and that we can somehow monitor the status of what our marine environment is. And another little exciting piece that we're working on that we provide now is the state of the California current. And it kind of gives us a snapshot of where the environment is through, you know, everything from the algae all the way up to the larger species in the food chain. It's tracking if are things changing, and if they are, what are those changes, and do we need to address those in how we manage resources. I really see that as a positive step forward. It also, I believe, because I am on the North Coast, and that's why I had the question yesterday, that, you know, we got to look holistically at these resources, because there's a U.S.-Canadian border that divides us two countries. It doesn't divide what the fish do. And many of these stocks that we're dealing with, canary, yellow-eye, some of them are more of a northern fish, and we don't know if we're pulling the whole picture of how do we look at these resources and what is the status of them, what do we contribute, how are their productivity structured, so we know what we do down here, how is it affected by, or is it affected by things that happen north of us. And that is a piece I think that we're going to need to continue to work on, not only just in the Canadian side of things, but we're also, sardines is a part of that in the southern part, and I'm sure there's other species down there in Mexico where the two governments really need to collaborate if we're really going to holistically look at doing the best thing for resources. We need to completely understand them and not let those international borders divide our management processes. We need to bring that together so we have a full view of what the status of the resource is. As far as reauthorization and new language, the tribes have not really proposed much, although we do feel, as I've talked to the tribes, that the status of our seat on the council is it requires the 3-name process and it has a term limit on it. And the tribes have suggested that we look at that because we need to be treated once again as a government, not as a constituent on the council, and the governments are allowed to keep their representation there as long as they feel that they're in those positions and doing what they need for the government. That the tribes should also have the same opportunity to select who we want and how long we want our people to be represented in these types of forums. On the Pacific Council, no, the Pacific Salmon Commission, there are no term limits. They do have the 3-name requirement, which can be kind of difficult if you've got one person that you're interested, or two, that we must still have to have a 3-person process in order to move forward with meeting all the obligations of our nominees. We are comfortable with the fact that NEPA, we believe, is represented in the process in MSA, and it is repetitory. I mean, the buffers we put in for our resources, the process that we have for the public to engage in our decision-making is, I believe, even far superior to the NEPA process, because there's so much time for people to respond, to be able to come up and testify, and it really does influence our decision-making. We don't just listen to the people, we actually try and react to what the statements they're making, and our testimonies that come out of the public are so good. I mean, people really do think about what they're trying to say, and I think the collaborative approach that Mike Bell talked about, where they do come in with a more focused, organized community type of approach, really helps us in trying to bring those initiatives forward and be able to establish those in our management processes. So we don't see repetitory, we believe it's repetitory having the NEPA process and the Magnuson process in this current structure that they're in, and don't have any conservation concerns with trying to maybe trim that down a little bit, unless we have some major changes in our management approaches that we'd feel comfortable with the positions that the councils have taken on that. With that, I think that will conclude my arguments. I'm arguing that way now. I'm not letting the arguments come this way. And thank the university and Dave and Andre once again for letting us come up and provide our tribal perspective on the Magnuson Act. Thank you.